They said the great minds of the age had come to Zurich. From the marble steps outside the Congress Center, you could see them arriving in small clusters, the professors with their overcoats buttoned to the throat, the graduate students clutching their papers as if they were rare flowers, the curious onlookers craning their necks to glimpse someone whose name they had only ever read in journals. The International Congress of Mathematicians was in full bloom, and the air itself seemed to hum with a strange energy. The hum of thought, of problems being wrestled with in real time, of centuries-old riddles daring someone to try again. Inside, the grand hall was all polished wood and soft golden light from chandeliers that had been hanging there long before Luca was born. The scent of fresh coffee floated from the refreshment tables, mingling with the faint chalk dust that escaped whenever someone in the lecture halls made a sweeping gesture at a blackboard. Luca did not belong here. At least, that is what most would have thought. He was 14, his dark hair cut unevenly by his own hand, his shirt sleeves rolled up neatly at the wrist to keep from brushing the glasses he carried. His father, an immigrant from Italy, owned a modest restaurant far from the city's bright center. Since his mother's passing 2 winters ago, Luca had taken up work wherever he could find it, washing dishes, delivering bread, and now, for these 2 weeks of the Congress, serving drinks to men and women whose names would one day be written in history books. The work was simple: move quietly, avoid spilling, and be invisible. Invisible was easier than people thought. When you were young and carried no title, when your shoes were scuffed and your accent gave you away, the world tended not to look at you for long. That was fine with Luca. He preferred to watch, and there was so much to watch. On one side of the hall, a French mathematician gestured wildly with his pen, speaking to a group about a paper on topology. Near the stairs, 2 women leaned over a notebook, whispering about combinatorial designs. Words like isomorphism and graph theory spilled into the air, drifting like leaves on a current. Luca, passing between them, caught fragments and stored them away in the same part of his mind that remembered how long to knead dough or how to balance a tray on uneven steps. Then, as he refilled the water jug at the corner table, he heard it. The phrase he had begun to hear again and again since the conference opened. P equals NP. It sounded almost like a riddle from a storybook, yet the faces of those who said it were serious, even a little reverent. The idea he had gathered from bits of conversation was this: there were certain problems in the world that were easy to check once you had the answer, but impossibly hard to solve in the first place. Like finding the one key that opened a locked chest. If someone handed you the key, you could try it in seconds and know it fit, but finding that exact key among billions could take a lifetime. The question was whether there was, hidden somewhere, a method, an algorithm, that could find the right key just as quickly as testing it. If that were true, if P really were equal to NP, then all those hard problems might not be so hard after all. Locks could be picked in an instant. Codes could be broken before the ink was dry. And the balance of knowledge and power in the world would tilt overnight. At the far end of the hall, one of the blackboards was covered from corner to corner in chalk marks. From a distance, it looked like a city map drawn by someone who had forgotten the names of the streets. Lines curving, intersecting, doubling back. Some ended abruptly, as though the traveler had reached a cliff and turned away. Others disappeared under layers of corrections and notes in smaller, tighter handwriting. Luca found himself slowing as he passed, his eyes tracing the loops and angles, the way one might follow the thread of a story in a book with no pictures. He did not understand all the symbols, not yet. But he recognized something in the way they were arranged, the same kind of symmetry he had seen when his father laid out the pans in the oven to make sure every loaf baked evenly, or when he himself rearranged the spice jars so the ones most often used were always closest to hand. It was a logic you could almost feel, like the balance of a tray that stayed level as you walked. A voice, sharp as frost, cut into his thoughts. "You are only a waiter," it said in accented English. Luca turned his head. A tall man with a narrow face and silver hair was looking straight at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What could you possibly know about P equals NP?" The remark was not loud enough for the whole room to hear, but a few nearby heads turned. Luca felt their glances, quick and dismissive, like the flick of a curtain in a breeze. He met the professor's gaze for a moment. Then, as if the words had been no more than a change in the weather, he lowered his head slightly in a gesture of respect. "Excuse me, sir," he murmured, stepping past with his tray. The clink of the glasses almost covered the sound of his own heartbeat. He did not feel anger. Instead, somewhere deep within, something had shifted. The pieces in his mind, bits of overheard conversations, shapes of equations glimpsed on blackboards, memories of puzzles he had solved in the kitchen at home, began to move, not into a full picture, not yet, but into the outline of one, like a melody half forgotten, the kind you hum without realizing until one day the rest of the notes return. He finished his round of the hall and returned to the service station, where the other waiters stood in small groups, talking quietly. Beyond them, through the open doorway to the lecture theater, he could see another blackboard, more chalk lines, more maps of invisible cities, and in his mind, the hum grew louder. The professor's words had been meant to keep him in his place. Instead, they had marked a beginning. The door to the small VIP lounge was propped open with a folded program. Beyond it, the noise of the Congress softened, as if someone had lowered a curtain between the world of applause and this quiet pocket of carpet, lamplight, and low chairs. Luca came in with a tray of clean glasses. He moved with the unhurried care of a boy who had learned early that it was better to do a simple task well than to do a grand one poorly. He set the tray down, checked the water carafe, and only then noticed the sheaf of papers abandoned on a side table near the window. They were not the crisp handouts from a talk. These pages had the weary look of a traveling companion, corners bent, a coffee ring like a pale moon on the title page. Margins crowded with small handwriting where someone had argued with himself and lost track of who was winning. Luca did not mean to pry, but papers left in a busy room are like a book left open on a park bench. They call out to be saved, at least long enough to find their owner. He glanced around. No one seemed to be waiting for them. He slipped one page from the stack and held it in both hands so it would not tremble. Lines of symbols crossed the page like fences on a hillside. They were familiar shapes, the kind he had traced in the air while standing outside lecture rooms during his breaks. Graphs with nodes and edges, tiny circles connected by straight lines, a few inequalities, a paragraph in careful print that spoke of reductions between problems, as if problems were paths on a map and one could lay a clean road from the gate of one to the doorstep of another. In the margin, a small note read, "Try a direct carp-style reduction." Beneath it, a second hand had written, "Or think in flows." Luca could not claim the formal training to read it all, yet the page was not a wall to him. It was a kitchen he could walk through. To an older reader, or to anyone who had never watched bread rise and fall under a changing oven, this might sound strange. But there are ways of thinking that are cousins to one another. In his father's kitchen, he had learned to see the station as a graph. The chopping block was one node, the stove another, the sink a third, the pantry a fourth. Each path between them had a cost measured in steps and seconds and the risk of a spill. If you reached for the salt, then turned to rinse your hands, then remembered the herbs, you had walked a path that did not love you. In the long nights after his mother died, when the kitchen was quiet and the pans were drying, he would rehearse routes in his head. He would ask, "What is the shortest tour that touches every station and returns to the start before the sauce burns?" He did not know then that other people had given names to these questions. He only knew that there was always a better way to move, a tighter loop to trace with your body and your breath. He read another paragraph. It spoke of P and NP. He had begun to form a plain understanding of those letters in the last few days, listening to conversations in the grand hall. P was the class of problems that could be solved quickly by a step-by-step recipe. Quickly, to mathematicians, meant that the time it took did not explode when the size of the problem grew. NP was the class of problems for which, if someone handed you an answer, you could check it quickly, like checking that a key fits a lock, even if you had no quick way to find that key among a mountain of keys. The mysterious part was the border between the two. If every answer that could be checked quickly could also be found quickly, then P would be equal to NP, and the world would be different by morning. The paper in his hands seemed to be about building a bridge between two specific problems. It used a phrase he had heard before and liked at once: polynomial time reduction. It sounded grand, but its heart was simple. If you could take any instance of problem A and, without wasting time, transform it into an instance of problem B, such that solving B also solved A, then you had shown a kind of kinship between them. It was like learning that the trick to cutting perfect ravioli squares would also teach you how to fold napkins into swans. The actions were different, but the rhythm of the steps, the count in your wrists, was the same. He held the page a little closer. The notes mentioned a classic problem, the satisfiability of logical formulas. SAT, they called it. A puzzle in which one asks if there exists a way to assign true or false to a set of statements so that the whole expression comes out true. He remembered a night in the kitchen when a supplier delivered the wrong vegetables and his father had to invent a menu from what was left. For each dish, there were choices, yes or no. Tomato here, basil there, substitute lemon for capers. The question had been whether there was a combination that satisfied the menu, the prep time, and the taste of the regulars who barreled through the door at 6. He had sat on a stool and watched his father juggle the choices, and felt the little spark that comes when a machine in your head starts whispering, "There is a way." On the second page, there was a sketch that at first looked like a child's drawing of a kite. On closer view, it was a construction that took one kind of graph and folded it into another, preserving something essential, the way a careful cook preserves the aroma of garlic by adding it to the pan at just the right moment. Luca traced the lines with a finger. One node here mirrors that node there. This edge becomes that constraint. The language of the paper did not sing to everyone, but he could hear its tune. He set the page down and took the top 2 pages to the window, where the light was kinder. He rested his tray on the radiator so his hands would be free. Then he did something he had learned to do only since his mother died. He breathed. In through the nose for 4, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 6. It was the old cook's rhythm of patience, learned from watching dough rise when there was still an hour before the oven was ready. The breathing made the edges of the world softer and the middle clearer. On a side table stood a small pad meant for telephone messages. He took a sheet and borrowed a pencil from beside the guest book. His plan was not a plan at all. It was a trial, the way one tests the heat of a pan by hovering a hand over it. He wrote in a cramped hand, starting with something familiar from the page. If the problem was to find a tour through a set of points with minimal cost, and another problem was to satisfy a collection of logical clauses, could one be turned into the other without wasting time? Could you trade the language of travel for the language of truth and keep the pulse the same? He tried a toy example. 3 points, where cost from the oven to the sink was 2, from the sink to the pantry was 3, and from the pantry to the chopping block was 1. An old habit moved in him now. He labeled each step not with distance, but with choices. If we go oven, then sink, then we cannot go pantry before chopping block, because the sauce will break. He sketched a small table of constraints. If this, then that. If not that, then this. It was not exactly the graph of the paper, but in his head the family resemblance was clear. Each path in the kitchen gave rise to a clause, a demand that must be satisfied for the meal to be on time and right. The question became, is there an assignment to the choices that makes all dishes arrive hot? If so, that implies a route. And if I could, for any kitchen route, write the equivalent clauses quickly, then I had drawn a path from travel to truth. If someone else could solve the truth version quickly, it would tell me how to move through the kitchen. He paused. This was only a metaphor, and he knew it. But metaphors, if you treat them with respect, sometimes let you cross a river that has no bridge yet. He copied a small construction from the abandoned pages, but softened it, simplifying the cases. He did not try to prove anything. He aimed at the feeling his father trusted when deciding the order of pans. A balanced plan has a certain quiet. The loud parts and the slow parts line up like the beads on a rosary, and the cook can pass over them without losing pace. The pencil moved again. He drew a tiny gadget, no bigger than a postage stamp on the page. 3 nodes that together forced a choice, the way the door of the walk-in cooler and the clock on the wall force a choice on hot nights. He named them A, B, and C. If you take A, you cannot take B. If you take B, you must take C. If you take C, you must not take A. He wrote a short sentence under it. Encodes clause A or not B or C. He blinked at that. He had not meant to be so formal. He smiled because the line looked like something out of a book he had not yet the money to buy. But seeing it there told him the metaphor had slipped closer to the shore of the real problem. Constraint became clause. Step became literal. Route became assignment. From down the hall came a burst of applause, and then the soft sea-like noise of people standing and letting their approval wash over the room. A talk had ended. In a minute, the lounge would fill again, and the owner of these pages would return to claim them. Luca took a last, longer look. On the last page in the stack, near the bottom, someone had written a single plain sentence. Most reductions fail because we try to drag the whole kitchen into the dining room. Bring only what the recipe needs. He had to smile at that. In the next paragraph, the writer recommended stripping a construction to its bones and then adding back the minimal ribs needed for strength. It was advice he had heard, in other words, from an old baker who delivered loaves to their street when he was small. The baker would say, "Do not carry the dough. Carry the dough's desire to be bread." He gathered the pages and straightened them so the coffee ring lay like a badge on the top. Beside the stack, he left a small note in his neatest hand. Found by the window. No one saw who left it. Then he tucked the message paper with his sketches into his pocket, to be read again later when he could stand still. He returned to his tray, lifted it, and stepped back into the breath of the Congress. The rest of the day, he worked in a kind of gentle concentration, as if each glass he lifted was a term in a proof he must carry carefully from line to line without breaking. He heard the professors and students as one hears birds in trees. Patterns of words floated down. Kernel, witness, verification. He understood enough now to place them on the shelves of his mind. To verify a solution is to check the work of a stranger quickly. To witness is to provide the small extra piece that makes the check easy, the way showing your stamped ticket speeds your passage at the gate. The idea that most stirred him was reduction, that folding from one problem to another without adding weight. It felt like a secret door in an old house. At the late coffee break, while the espresso machine hissed and sighed, he stole a minute by the service corridor to look again at his pencil lines. He asked himself a question he liked because it was blunt. If I had a box that could solve SAT quickly, what would I feed it to make it tell me how to walk the kitchen? He imagined writing the rules of the kitchen as clauses. He imagined the box returning a small card that said, "Take the sink first, then the pantry, then the block, and do not return to the sink until the pasta is in the water." He laughed softly because the box sounded like his mother. Then he grew quiet, because he could almost feel, as a musician feels a coming note, that there was a small, clean way to do the translation. He did not yet see it fully, but the outline of it stood behind the curtain. Near closing, while gathering empty cups from the grand hall, he glimpsed the tall professor who had spoken sharply to him that morning. The man stood with two other elders and was saying something about hardness results. The word hardness had a technical flavor to it here. Hardness meant that one problem carried within it the weight of an entire family. That if you could lift this one rock, you could lift the quarry. The professor used his hands when he said it, as if he were cradling the stone. Luca saw the gesture and thought of the small gadget he had drawn. Maybe a family could be carried by something that fit in a palm. When the last session ended, and the halls began to empty, the VIP lounge filled briefly with the tired sweetness of people who had talked too long about things they loved. The owner of the notes returned, a woman in a blue jacket with her hair tied back. She looked at the table, saw the stack, and pressed her fingers to her heart, as if greeting a friend. Luca felt a sudden rush of relief. He had not wanted those pages to vanish into the cleaning bin. As she lifted them, she noticed the small line he had written, "Found by the window." No one saw who left it. She glanced around the room and smiled to no one in particular, then tucked the papers into a leather folio and was gone. Luca finished his shift, counted the glasses, and swept a corner of the lounge where someone had spilled sugar. On his way out, he paused at the blackboard that had earlier looked like a city map. Now it bore the traces of a day of battles. Arrows added, asterisks marking a step that had saved a proof or sunk it. At the bottom right, in small, tidy print, someone had written, "Try not to be clever, be clear." It struck him as advice he could follow even when he forgot the rest. The night air in Zurich was crisp. He took the long way home, down the quiet streets where the shops had pulled in their displays and the last light in the tailors had gone out. In his pocket, the message paper was warm from his hand. At a bench near a canal, he sat and spread it out again, weighing the corners with coins so the breeze would not take it. He read what he had written as if it had been the work of someone he admired. The effect of this small kindness was to quiet the voice that said, "You are only a waiter." A boy who reads his own words as if they belong to the world can sometimes trick his heart into believing the world will read them too. He closed his eyes and, without writing, rehearsed the map one more time. Kitchen to clauses. Clauses to a box that answers yes or no, yes to a route. Route to a plan, plan to a meal. The chain felt plausible, and the feeling was not nothing. He had learned in the kitchen that the right feeling at the right moment can rescue a dish from error. It is not proof, but it keeps you from quitting. He rose and walked on. At home, his father was already asleep in the chair by the radio, a newspaper fallen over his chest like a blanket. Luca folded the paper, kissed his father's forehead softly, and slipped into the small room that had once been his mother's sewing corner. He lit the desk lamp and laid the message sheet beside a stack of old-school notebooks. On the top page of the notebook, in a boy's round hand from a younger time, someone had written the words that were now the spine of his days. Work until the fire becomes warmth. He sharpened his pencil. He drew the little gadget again, and this time he wrote in the symbols he had seen on the abandoned pages, but in his own slower voice. If clause is X or Y or not Z, then gadget with 3 doors so that one must open and the others align. He added a second gadget to carry over a choice from one part of the route to the next. He wrote a sentence that felt like a promise. Each path through the gadgets is in one-to-one match with a plan that satisfies the kitchen. When he finally lay down, the lamp turned low, the city quiet as a held breath. He felt again the steady joy that had come to him sometimes in the months after his mother died. It was not a joy that came from winning. It was the joy of seeing a way forward that did not break anything precious. He understood that the men and women at the Congress cared about the question of P and NP for reasons grander than a kitchen. They thought of codes and cures and the vaults of banks and the secrets of distant telescopes. But he also understood that big doors sometimes swing on small hinges and that the hinge has to be clean and simple and honest, or the door sticks. Sleep found him quickly. In the last moment before it took him, he thought of the note on the blackboard. Try not to be clever. Be clear. In the morning, he would carry water again, and he would watch and listen. And when the room emptied, he would return to the small pages where his own hand had begun to speak. Not everyone who touches a formula understands it. But sometimes the boy who carries the glasses sees the line that others stepped over in their hurry. And when he sees it, he does not rush to claim it. He sweeps the floor, he puts away the cups, and then, in the quiet after, he writes 3 lines that feel as natural as breathing, and he waits to see if they hold. The third day of the Congress began with a winter light that made the lake shimmer like hammered silver. In the grand hall, the morning air was still warming, and there was a faint smell of paper and wool coats that had been worn through the cold walk from the trams. Luca arrived early, carrying trays of small porcelain cups for the coffee service. He liked these first minutes. Before the doors opened fully, when the great blackboard stood clean and the rows of seats waited like empty fields. By now he knew the rhythm of the Congress. The early hours were for heavy talks, dense proofs, complicated diagrams, whispered debates in the aisles. Midday sessions were lighter, with a certain generosity toward the curious public. That morning's schedule had an open discussion titled Unsolved Problems in Theoretical Computer Science, and beside it, in bold letters, the name of a famous American professor. Luca had seen him once or twice across the hall, a tall man with a slow, theatrical way of speaking, as if each word was a chess move. When the session began, the hall filled quickly. The professor walked to the stage and stood before the largest blackboard in the building, his hands clasped behind him. His voice was deep enough that even the last row could hear without strain. "Friends," he began, "in our field, there are questions that resist us not because they are clever, but because they are simple and implacable. P equals NP is one such question." The words rippled through the hall. A few pens began to scratch on paper. Luca, from his place near the back wall with the water jug, listened. "In plain terms," the professor went on, "P equals NP asks whether every problem whose answer can be quickly verified can also be quickly solved. If yes, then many locks we thought were safe will fall open. And if no, then the shape of difficulty in the universe is different than we dreamed." He turned to the board and drew 2 large circles, one inside the other. He labeled the smaller one P and the larger NP. We know P is contained in NP. What we do not know is whether there is any space between them at all. A murmur of assent passed through the mathematicians. Luca's eyes followed the chalk, but in his head he translated it into the kitchen of his father's restaurant. P was the set of dishes you could cook quickly from scratch. NP was the set of dishes where, if someone handed you the finished plate, you could taste it and say, "Yes, this is correct," just as quickly. The question was whether there existed dishes you could check quickly but never cook quickly, unless you found some hidden trick. The professor let the silence linger for a heartbeat, then smiled with a kind of practiced mischief. "Let us be bold," he said. "I will pose a challenge. I will write here a special case of an NP complete problem, the Boolean satisfiability of a formula with a modest number of variables, 30 clauses, each with 3 literals. If anyone in this hall, anyone at all, can find a satisfying assignment in 30 minutes, I will hand you this envelope." He lifted a cream-colored envelope from the podium. "Inside is a check for the full honorarium I have been paid for this talk." The audience laughed, but there was a ripple of excitement, too. He was not offering a solution to P equals NP. He was offering a single instance, carefully chosen. Hard enough to occupy seasoned minds, but small enough to be a fair game. On the board, he began to write the clauses, each one a little knot of letters with bars for negations. X1 or not X2 or X5 and so on. The lines multiplied until the board was a forest of symbols. When he stepped back, a journalist in the front row called out, "Do you accept attempts from outsiders?" The question carried a hint of teasing. "Or is this for the initiated only?" The professor spread his hands. "Anyone who thinks they see a way is welcome." The hall chuckled. It was the kind of moment where people expected a graduate student to rush forward, or perhaps a retired professor with nothing to lose. Instead, the silence deepened. Luca, standing at the back, felt his gaze drawn to the board. He could not see every clause clearly from this distance, but the shape of them was familiar. The same small gadgets he had drawn in his notebook, the same rhythm of choice and constraint. A thought came to him that was less a decision than a recognition. This is my kitchen. He did not think of the envelope or the money. He thought of the satisfaction of seeing the loops close, the plan settle into balance. Without realizing, he had stepped forward a few paces. Someone noticed. A man in the aisle whispered to his neighbor, "It's one of the waiters." The neighbor raised an eyebrow. A stir ran through the nearer rows, the way a pond's surface ripples when a single pebble falls. The journalist who had asked the question smiled broadly. "Well," he said, "it seems we have a volunteer." Luca felt the weight of the eyes on him, but also something steadier, the calm that came when a problem sat squarely before him and the kitchen clock had begun to tick. He set the water jug on a side table and walked toward the stage. The professor watched him approach with a look that was not unkind, but edged with curiosity. "And you are?" he asked when Luca stood a few feet from the board. "Luca, sir," he said quietly. "I work here for the week." A ripple of amusement passed through the hall. Someone coughed in what might have been a laugh. The professor tilted his head. "You understand the rules? 30 minutes, 1 solution." Luca nodded. "I understand." The professor stepped aside and offered him the chalk. Luca took it, feeling the fine dust between his fingers. The board loomed before him, dense with clauses. He did not try to read them all at once. He began where he always began, by looking for the places where the structure was already leaning in one direction. If clause A says X1 must be true or X2 must be false, and clause B says X2 must be true, then X1 must be true. Small steps, the kind that let you breathe as you move. Behind him he heard the shuffle of people settling in to watch. Some were amused, some skeptical. A few were already sketching the problem on their own pads, racing him in private. Luca did not rush. He marked a variable assignment here, another there, each one chosen to avoid a clash in the kitchen of clauses. The pattern began to open like a knot loosening under gentle fingers. Halfway through, a voice from the third row whispered, "He's using a greedy propagation. It will trap him." Luca did not look up. He had learned in the kitchen that sometimes the shortest route was not a straight line, but a curve that bent around the heat. Minutes passed. The lines of chalk on the board grew in small bursts, each one a confirmation or an adjustment. A few times he paused, erasing a step and choosing another, not from panic, but from the quiet satisfaction of aligning the plan with the ingredients at hand. In his head, The clauses were stations. The truth values were the dishes. The assignments were the plates sliding onto the pass at just the right moment. Then, with about 5 minutes left, the last open clause settled into place. He stepped back. The board was no longer a forest, but a garden, each plant marked with a small sign, true or false. He laid the chalk on the ledge. "It satisfies all 30, he said softly. The professor stepped forward and, without a word, began checking. Clause by clause, he nodded, his finger following the logic. A few people stood to see better. Others leaned forward in their seats. When he reached the end, the professor turned to the hall and spread his hands. "It is correct." The applause began cautiously, then grew, filling the hall like the swell of an orchestra finding its full voice. Luca felt the sound wash over him. It was not pride he felt, not exactly. It was the relief of having carried a tray through a crowded room without spilling a drop. The professor handed him the envelope. "Well done," he said, and there was no frost in his tone now. Luca took it with a small nod. He had no plan for the money. For the moment, it was enough to have stood at the board and seen the plan complete. As he stepped down from the stage, he caught the eye of the journalist in the front row. The man's expression was no longer playful, but measuring, as if trying to decide what kind of story he had just witnessed. In the quiet that followed, as the crowd began to disperse for lunch, Luca returned to the side table and picked up the water jug. He still had glasses to fill. The lunch break had barely begun, but the open discussion from the morning still lingered in the hallways like the scent of strong coffee. People stood in small knots, replaying what they had seen. Some spoke with quiet admiration, others with the guarded tone of professionals unsure whether they had just witnessed luck, skill, or something else entirely. The envelope with the professor's honorarium was no longer on the podium. It now rested in Luca's pocket, though he had not yet opened it. In truth, it was not the money that mattered to him. It was the feeling. Not pride, not triumph. Something quieter and steadier, like the warmth from a stove long after the fire has gone down. For a boy who had spent so much of his life in the background, carrying trays through other people's conversations, the board had been a different kind of table, and the chalk a different kind of ladle. That afternoon, the Congress resumed in a smaller auditorium. The topic was New Approaches to Reductions Between NP-Complete Problems. It was a session intended for specialists, but the organizers had left the doors open. Luca, his duties light for the hour, slipped into the back to listen. At the front, a lecturer from Warsaw spoke about transformations between graph problems. How to take a question about finding the shortest Hamiltonian path and turn it into a question about satisfying a set of logical clauses. The speaker used the word isomorphism several times, explaining patiently that it meant a perfect one-to-one correspondence between two structures, where every connection in one had an exact mirror in the other. Luca understood. He remembered it from the kitchen. Moving the spice rack closer to the stove was like shortening an edge in a graph. Placing two chopping boards side by side was like merging two vertices into one. The Warsaw lecturer's diagrams seemed like blueprints for an invisible kitchen, one where ingredients were ideas and the stove was a blackboard. Halfway through, the lecturer paused for questions. A professor in the front row, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a low knot, stood and asked about optimizing such reductions. "Could one compress the transformation so far," she asked, "that the structure of one problem emerges almost instantly in the other, without the usual detour?" The speaker smiled. "That would be beautiful," he said, "and impossible, I think. There is always overhead." It was at that moment that someone in the room, Luca would later remember only the deep voice and the slight American drawl, called out from the middle rows, "Let the boy try." The room turned. A few people laughed, thinking it a joke. But the silver-haired professor from the front row looked directly toward the back, where Luca stood by the wall. "You," she said. "The one from this morning. Would you care to show us?" Luca hesitated. He was not here to speak. He was here to listen. And yet the thought of the board, clean and waiting, was like the smell of dough ready for the oven. It asked to be touched. He stepped forward. The Warsaw lecturer stepped aside. A fresh sheet of blackboard waited. Luca took the chalk between finger and thumb, feeling again the fine grit that seemed to anchor him in the moment. He began not with a dense proof, but with a picture. 3 small circles in a row connected by lines. "Suppose," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the room's stillness, "we have a choice to make between 3 stations in a kitchen. Each choice rules out or requires another. We can draw these as nodes in a graph, with edges meaning the choices are linked." A faint murmur ran through the audience, some amused at the kitchen metaphor, others leaning forward to see where it would go. "Now," Luca continued, "each such gadget encodes a clause, true, false, true, or false, true, false. If we link many of these gadgets together, each representing a clause in a satisfiability problem, the structure of one becomes the map of the other. To reduce one problem to the other is simply to build the kitchen so that any route through it corresponds exactly to a satisfying assignment." He wrote only 3 lines beneath the diagram, not a proof in the formal sense, but 3 crisp correspondences. Clause, gadget variable assignment, path choice, satisfiable formula, feasible route. It was enough. The rest, in a sense, was already on the board in their minds. When he stepped back, the room did not clap. It did not stir. It held still the way a kitchen does when the bread in the oven has reached its perfect rise and everyone in the room knows it without speaking. The silver-haired professor was the first to move. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, and studied the diagram as though it were a rare coin. Behind her, the Warsaw lecturer's brow furrowed, his eyes darting between the circles and the lines of correspondence. In the 3rd row, a young postdoc began sketching the same 3 circles in her notebook, adding clauses beside them to test the mapping. For a long half-minute, the silence thickened. Then, in the back of the room, someone began to scribble furiously in the margins of a conference program. A man in a tweed jacket whispered to his neighbor, "It's obvious once you see it, but I never saw it that way." The silver-haired professor straightened at last. "You've collapsed the scaffolding," she said almost to herself. "There's no wasted frame." Luca was not sure what to say, so he nodded slightly and set the chalk down. The Warsaw lecturer cleared his throat. "Of course, the formal proof would require—" He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the board as though trying to summon a counterexample and finding none. Someone else spoke from the far side of the room, an older man with a clipped British accent. "Do you realize," he said, "that if this correspondence holds for all cases of the construction, it trims a good deal of the standard reduction overhead? Not enough to settle P versus NP, perhaps, but—" He did not finish. The room was already tilting toward the blackboard again, scholars pulling their chairs forward, pens uncapped. The 3 small lines, no more than a handful of words, had become the center of gravity. Luca stepped back toward the wall. His part was done. He knew that in a few minutes the room would erupt into arguments, that chalk would fly, that the tidy diagram would vanish under layers of annotations. That was fine. He had never wanted to own the board. He had only wanted to set the first plate down in the pass, knowing others would carry the rest to the tables. And yet, as he reached the door, he heard something that made him pause. The silver-haired professor, still staring at the 3 lines, said softly, "This is the way I wish I had looked at it 30 years ago." The words hung in the air like the last note of a song. The morning after Luca had drawn 3 small circles and 3 smaller lines on the board, the Congress Center seemed to hum differently. It was not the usual hum of scholarly routine, not just the sound of pens scratching notes or the shuffling of people between lecture halls. It was a hum that carried something restless, like the way a kitchen feels when the first unexpected order of the night comes in and the cooks start glancing toward the door. By mid-morning, Luca could feel it even without hearing his name. He passed through the grand hall with a tray of coffee cups and caught words in half-sentences. If the mapping is that tight, it would cut the reduction length, but it might not generalize. Did you see it? The waiter. He kept his eyes low, the way he had been taught to in busy rooms. But inside, his mind kept returning to the image of the board from yesterday, the clean diagram, the correspondences that had felt so natural they might have been there all along. He did not feel ownership of them so much as recognition, the way you recognize the smell of bread even if you do not know whose oven it came from. In the corner near the windows, a cluster of young researchers leaned over a notebook. One of them noticed Luca passing and gave a nod that was not unfriendly, but assessing, as if weighing what they knew of him against the picture in their mind. The others followed his glance and fell silent until he had moved on. It was just before lunch when the summons came. A man in a dark suit, not a waiter, not a professor, approached Luca by the service counter. "You're wanted in Hall C," he said, "by the review panel." Luca set down the tray he was wiping. "Now?" "Now." Hall C was smaller than the grand auditorium, but its air was heavier. At the front sat a row of 6 professors, each with a folder in front of them. 2 were from Europe, 2 from North America, 1 from Japan, and 1 from India. Their faces were the faces of people who had spent their lives defending the walls of their subject from bad arguments, sloppy thinking, and the quick fixes that came apart under real weight. The silver-haired professor who had spoken kindly to him yesterday was there too, but seated off to the side, as if not officially part of the panel. When Luca entered, she gave him a small nod. One of the panel, a tall man with a deep crease between his brows, spoke first. "We have heard reports of a certain simplification you proposed yesterday." He glanced at the folder in front of him. "A reduction diagram linking SAT clauses to route planning gadgets. We would like you to present it here, in full, and answer our questions." Luca hesitated. "I am not trained," he said carefully. "I don't know the formal language." "You can use your own words," another panelist said. "We'll translate." He stepped to the board. The chalk felt familiar now. But the air in the room was different from yesterday's open session. This was not curiosity. This was examination. He drew the 3 circles again, the connections, the mapping from clauses to gadgets. As he spoke, he kept the rhythm slow, not to impress but to make sure every step could be walked without tripping. When he finished, the questions began. They came quickly, sometimes on top of each other. "Does your mapping preserve satisfiability in both directions? Can it handle clauses with fewer than 3 literals? What about variable repetition across gadgets? Have you proven that the transformation is polynomial in size? What prevents the overhead from growing in the worst case?" Luca answered as best he could, not in the formal cadence of proof, but in the plain reasoning of someone who has spent years carrying trays through tight spaces without spilling a drop. "Both directions, yes, if the gadgets are linked so that each variable has a single route," he said to the first question. "For fewer literals, I collapse one node, but the constraints stay," he said to the second. He gestured with his hand to explain repetition. "It's like 2 stations in the kitchen needing the same ingredient. You pass the jar down the line, not back and forth." When they pressed about polynomial size, he admitted, "I don't have the proof. I only see that the number of gadgets grows in a line with the clauses." The panelists scribbled in their folders. Some frowned. Some looked almost amused, though not cruelly. The Japanese professor leaned forward. "Where did you learn this?" "In my father's kitchen," Luca said simply. There was a pause, then a chuckle from somewhere in the back of the room, not mocking, but startled. The silver-haired professor smiled faintly. The questions went on for nearly an hour. By the end, Luca felt as though he had been through a long service on a night when the ovens had run too hot. His shirt clung to his back. He had not lost his calm, but he knew this was not the same as convincing them. Some of the faces still held doubt. One or two looked almost ready to argue with each other rather than with him. Finally, the tall man with the brow crease closed his folder. "You understand, young man, that if this holds, and we are not yet saying it does, it would alter the way certain NP-complete problems are taught, perhaps even how they are approached in research." Luca nodded. "I understand." The panel dismissed him. As he left, the silver-haired professor caught his eye again. "Keep your notes," she said softly, "and keep them safe." By evening, the story had grown legs. In the lobby, Luca heard a man telling two others, "He stumbled onto it. Sheer luck." In the cafeteria line, someone else said, "It's clever but trivial in the general case." In another corner, a younger voice argued, "You're missing the point. It's not a proof, but it's the cleanest mapping I've seen." It was strange to be talked about in this way, as if he were not in the same building. Strange, and a little like watching cooks argue over a dish while you stand unseen in the doorway, knowing exactly how you made it. That night, he returned to the small room he rented for the week. He took out his notebook and, by the dim light of the desk lamp, rewrote the diagram, this time adding more steps than before, more than he needed for himself. Not because he doubted the idea, but because he had learned in the kitchen that a recipe written too sparsely could not be trusted when the pressure was on. When he set the pencil down, the silence of the room felt different from the silence of the panel earlier that day. This one was companionable, like the quiet that settles over a table after a shared meal. Outside, the wind from the lake rattled the shutters. Inside, the three circles waited on the page, steady as stones. Tomorrow, he knew, the questions would return. But for tonight, he let the warmth from the small radiator seep into his bones, and he thought of his father's kitchen, how the pot simmered even when no one was watching, and how some things, once set to cook, could not be hurried and should not be left alone. The Congress Center had its own rhythm, the rustle of papers, the echo of footsteps down wide corridors, the low murmur before a lecture began. But Luca's own rhythm had been formed long before these marble floors and polished brass handles. It had been shaped by a kitchen no bigger than a tram car, with one narrow window looking out on a street where the delivery trucks came in the morning and the shopkeepers swept the pavement at night. His father, Marco, had come to Zurich 20 years ago from a hill town in Italy where the winters were mild but the work was scarce. He had been a mason there, but in the city, he found a job as a dishwasher in a restaurant. The wages were thin, the hours long, but he learned the language of menus and orders. Over time, he saved enough to open his own place. Nothing fancy, just 6 tables, a counter, and the steady customers who came for the pasta al forno and the coffee that Marco brewed strong enough to wake the dead. Luca's earliest memories were of standing on a stool to see over that counter. He remembered the hiss of onions hitting the pan, the way steam curled like a ribbon toward the ceiling, the warm, yeasty smell that came from the bread oven in the back. His mother, Elena, moved between the tables with the same quiet grace she would later pass to her son. She never wrote orders down. She remembered them all, matching each dish to the faces that had asked for it. When Luca was 7, Elena fell ill. The doctors used long words that Marco struggled to translate. The kitchen kept running. It had to. but the air in their small apartment above it grew heavy with the scent of herbs meant to soothe a cough that never went away. By the time Luca turned 10, his mother was gone. After that, the kitchen changed. Marco took on more hours himself, often opening before dawn and locking up close to midnight. There was no money for a full-time helper, so Luca learned to wash dishes, to set tables, to carry plates without letting the steam burn his hands. School still claimed some of his hours, but it was the kitchen that claimed his mind. The kitchen was, without him realizing it, his first mathematics classroom. It taught him that the shortest path between 2 points was not always the straight line, if the straight line passed too close to a hot oven or blocked the only way to the sink. It taught him that timing was a kind of equation. Start the pasta at the same moment as the sauce, and they will finish together. It taught him that a mistake, a forgotten ingredient, a pan left too long, could sometimes be repaired if you understood the structure of the problem. He learned to think in loops and constraints. If the bread was in the oven, you could not use it for bruschetta yet, so you needed another starter that did not require bread. If 2 orders both needed the same pan, you had to choose the sequence that left no one waiting too long. He began to see these as puzzles, though he did not yet know the names mathematicians gave them: optimization, scheduling, constraint satisfaction. Marco noticed his son's knack for rearranging the workflow. One winter evening, when the rush had passed and the tables were empty, he told Luca, "You see the kitchen like a map. I only see it as work." "It is work," Luca said, drying a plate. "Yes," Marco replied, "but you are always finding the shorter road." The shorter road became a habit. In the quiet hours between lunch and dinner, when the kitchen was clean and the next deliveries had not yet arrived, Luca would draw little maps in the margins of old menus. Each station, stove, sink, counter, pantry, was a dot. Each path between them had a number, not for distance exactly, but for the time it took to walk or the hazard it carried. He would try to draw the route that touched each station once before returning to the start. Sometimes he found one that saved only a single step. Other times he cut the distance in half. He found joy in both. When he was 12, he began helping his father plan the weekly menu. This was not just cooking. It was a kind of logic problem. They had to choose dishes that used the same ingredients in different ways, so nothing went to waste, and that could be cooked on the same equipment without bottlenecks. A mistake here could mean an hour of delay during the evening rush, or spoiled food at the end of the week. Luca treated each choice like a variable in an equation, one whose value could ripple through the whole system. The silver tray came later. When Marco's restaurant had a slow winter, Luca found part-time work at a larger hotel. They needed someone to help in the banquet hall, carrying drinks and clearing plates. The silver tray was heavier than it looked, and keeping it level through a crowded room required the same balance as carrying 3 plates in the narrow aisle of their own kitchen. The trick was to keep your center steady, even if the crowd surged around you. That steadiness, the sense that the shortest path was sometimes the calmest, would follow him everywhere. At the hotel, Luca began hearing more of the world beyond the kitchen. Guests spoke of business, politics, research. Sometimes, serving at a private dinner, he would hear words like algorithm, graph theory, complexity. At first, they were just strange sounds. Then he began to catch pieces of meaning, enough to see that the puzzles he solved in the kitchen had cousins in the problems these guests debated over their wine. One evening, he carried a tray into a conference room where a mathematician was explaining the concept of reduction to a colleague. Luca caught the phrase, "If you can turn problem A into problem B, and B is easier to solve, then A becomes easier too." It was like hearing someone describe moving the spice rack closer to the stove, a small change that made everything else faster. By the time the International Congress of Mathematicians arrived in Zurich, Luca's mind was already trained to notice the structure of a problem the way other people notice color or tone. The Congress did not change that. It simply gave him a new language for it. The silver tray in his hands was not just a tool for serving water and coffee. It was a passport that let him slip between groups of the world's best minds without being noticed. And in those unnoticed moments, he collected ideas like a baker collecting seeds for the next batch of bread. Some were small and crumb-like. Others were whole kernels, ready to plant. In the days before he stepped to the board for the first time, he had begun hearing the letters P equals NP more and more often. He did not know the full shape of the question at first, but he recognized the pattern it pointed to. The gap between checking a solution and finding one. In the kitchen, he had always wanted to close that gap, to find the route that was as quick to discover as it was to follow. When the moment came, the challenge in the grand hall, the clean board, the dense forest of clauses, he did not feel like a boy stepping into a foreign land. He felt like a cook returning to his own kitchen after someone else had rearranged it. The pieces were familiar. They only needed to be put back in the order his hands already knew. Now, in the quiet of his small rented room after the long day of questions from the review panel, Luca looked at the silver tray leaning against the wall. It caught the lamplight in its shallow curve. To anyone else, it was just a tray. To him, it was proof that the path between the stove and the sink could be walked without spilling, and that the path between a messy problem and a clean solution might be the same. His father's kitchen had taught him many things: patience, precision, the value of seeing the whole map before moving. But most of all, it had taught him that a problem is not an enemy. It is a room you learn to move through, until the obstacles become part of the dance. The next day, he knew there would be more questions, more doubt, perhaps even resistance from those who guarded the walls of their field. But he also knew that what he carried from that kitchen was more than talent. It was the habit of finding the shorter road, even when no one else saw it yet. And habits, like well-seasoned pans, are not easily broken. The next morning began without ceremony. The lake outside the Congress Center lay still, a sheet of pale gray under the muted sky. Luca arrived early, as usual, to set the water jugs and cups in place before the first lectures began. He moved quietly, but in the back of his mind there was an awareness, a kind of echo from yesterday's panel, that the ground beneath him had changed. By mid-morning, he felt the shift. It began with a man in a charcoal suit standing by the entrance to the service corridor. His hair was close-cropped, his posture too rigid for a professor, and his eyes scanned the hall the way a guard might scan a crowd. When Luca passed with a tray of glasses, the man stepped forward. "Luca?" "Yes." "You'll come with me." It was not a question. They walked down a side hall that Luca had never entered. At the end was a narrow door, unmarked except for a small brass number. The man opened it without knocking. Inside was a small meeting room with blinds drawn over the windows. A long table stood in the center. 3 people were seated there: a woman in a black jacket, a man with rimless glasses, and, to Luca's surprise, the famous American professor who had set the SAT challenge in the Grand Hall 2 days earlier. The woman spoke first. "Sit down, Luca." He set the tray on the sideboard and took a chair at the end of the table. No one offered coffee. The man with the glasses slid a folder toward him. "You've drawn attention," he said. "More than you know." Luca kept silent. The woman continued. Her tone measured. "We represent an international technology consortium. Many of our members rely on the assumption that P does not equal NP. Banking systems, medical record security, government communications. If that assumption fails, the cryptographic infrastructure of the modern world is at risk." The words were heavy, but she spoke them as if they were simple fact, the way someone might explain why a kitchen must be cleaned before closing. "You believe," she went on, "that your mapping between problems if generalized, could shift that assumption. Luca hesitated. I don't know if it proves anything, he said honestly. It's just cleaner. That may be enough, the man with the glasses said. Sometimes clarity is more dangerous than proof. The American professor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was lower than when he had addressed the grand hall. Luca, I admire what you did. But I also know what happens when certain ideas are released without preparation. You could upend industries overnight. The woman opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper. This is a non-disclosure agreement, she said. We are prepared to compensate you generously, a sum far beyond anything you would earn in years of service work. In exchange, you will not publish, present, or discuss your mapping with anyone outside a designated list of reviewers. Luca glanced at the paper, then back at her. And if I don't sign? The man with the glasses smiled without warmth. Then your life becomes complicated. You may find your work discredited, your opportunities closed. Your father's restaurant could face sudden inspections, supply delays. These are not threats, Luca. They are the ways the world protects itself. The silence that followed was different from the silences in lecture halls. This one had weight in it and a kind of pressure. He thought of his father, of the rent on the restaurant, of the bills that seemed to multiply in winter. He thought of the warmth of the kitchen, the smell of bread, the quiet pride of carrying a tray without spilling. And he thought of the 3 circles on the board, how they had seemed to open a door. If this is dangerous, he asked slowly, shouldn't it be studied, prepared for? That's exactly what we propose, the woman said. Studied quietly, prepared quietly, without the noise of public attention. The American professor's gaze softened. You have a rare gift, Luca. Use it wisely. Sometimes wisdom means knowing when not to speak. They gave him the afternoon to decide. The folder stayed on the table. The man in the charcoal suit walked him back to the main hall, but did not speak. That evening, in his rented room, Luca sat with the paper before him. The offer was more money than he could imagine, enough to pay off his father's debts, repair the oven, even expand the restaurant, enough to step out of service work entirely. But every time he pictured signing it, he felt the same unease as when a pan was taken off the stove before the sauce had finished thickening. Something important would be left undone. At midnight, he pulled his notebook toward him and began to write. Not the mapping itself, that was already drawn in his earlier pages, but a record of how he had seen it, step by step, in the language of kitchens and routes. He wrote as if to a future student he might never meet, someone who would one day need to find the shorter road. When he was done, he placed the notebook in the lining of his suitcase beneath a layer of clean towels. If the time came when it had to be hidden, it would be easy enough. But for now, it was still his. The next morning, he walked back into the small meeting room. The 3 were waiting. He placed the folder on the table, unsigned. The woman's face did not change. You understand the consequences? Yes, Luca said. The American professor sighed. Then you had better make some allies. The morning after he refused to sign the paper, Luca woke to a quieter Zurich. A thin mist had rolled in from the lake, wrapping the city in pale gauze. From his small window, the street below looked softened, as if someone had turned the focus just slightly. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, listening to the distant tram bell. His refusal still felt like a stone in his chest, heavy but solid. Downstairs in the Congress Center, the air was different. Some faces looked away when he passed. Others watched openly, curiosity mingled with something else. Calculation. The 3 from the meeting room were nowhere to be seen, but their absence felt as deliberate as their presence had been yesterday. By mid-morning, while he was refilling the water carafes, a voice came from behind him. You made the right choice. He turned. The silver-haired professor, the one who had spoken kindly to him after his first presentation, stood there, her conference badge swinging on its lanyard. She had the easy posture of someone who had decided long ago not to waste energy on unnecessary formality. "They spoke to you, didn't they?" she said. Luca nodded. "They always do," she said. "Ideas travel faster than they can contain them. The moment something stirs the ground, they arrive with their nets." They sat in the small cafeteria by the side entrance, away from the main halls. She ordered tea, Luca stuck with water. The tables around them were half empty. "My name is Professor Clara Meinhardt," she said. "I teach computational complexity here in Zurich. I've seen your mapping, and more importantly, I've seen how you think. You've got an instinct for stripping a problem down to its bones." "That makes some people nervous." "Because it changes things?" Luca asked. "Because it makes them see the change before they're ready to admit it's coming." She leaned forward. "If you had signed their paper, it would have vanished into a locked drawer. Maybe in 10 years, maybe never, someone would open it again. The world would keep walking the long road, never knowing the shorter one was possible." "They said it could be dangerous," Luca said quietly. "That people could use it to break things." "They're not wrong," Clara admitted. "But keeping a door locked forever is not the same as making sure people are ready to open it. And there's another danger. If only a few have the key, they can decide who passes through." The afternoon sessions blurred into one another. Luca returned to his duties, but every so often he would catch Clara watching him from across the hall, as if to be sure he had not vanished. When the last lecture ended and the halls began to empty, she appeared again, coat draped over one arm. "Walk with me." They left the Congress Center and followed the path along the lake. The mist was lifting now, revealing the blue-gray water beneath. Swans moved near the shore, unbothered by the passing trams. Clara spoke as they walked. "You have something valuable, Luca. Not just the idea itself, the way you framed it. It's teachable. A clever proof can be a locked box, but a clean mapping is a bridge. If the world isn't ready to cross it now, then the best thing you can do is plant it where it will grow quietly." "How?" Luca asked. "By hiding it in plain sight." She explained her plan. Each year, she gave her top students a puzzle packet, a set of problems that seemed unconnected but, taken together, taught the architecture of a deeper idea. The students would work on them for months, sometimes years, passing the packet down to younger peers. Most never saw the full picture, but the few who did were the ones ready to hold it. "We'll take your mapping," Clara said, "and break it into pieces. A gadget here, a constraint there. We'll wrap each in a problem that looks innocent, a puzzle about roots in a village, a game with colored tiles. Only someone with patience will see how the pieces fit." "And when they do?" Luca asked. "Then they'll know they've found a seed. And seeds have a way of sprouting when the season turns." That night, they met in Clara's small office at the university. The walls were lined with books, some old and sun-faded, others thick with the gloss of new print. A pot of tea sat steaming on the desk. Luca placed his notebook on the table between them. Clara handled it as if it were something fragile, flipping through the pages slowly, pausing at the 3 circles. "You think in diagrams," she said. "Good. Diagrams cross languages." They worked for hours. Luca would sketch a gadget on a scrap of paper. Clara would suggest a disguise for it, turning variables into streetlights, constraints into ferry schedules. They built a chain of problems that, if solved in order, would reconstruct the mapping without ever stating it outright. By midnight, the first half of the packet was done. Clara gathered the papers and tied them with a thin ribbon. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll make copies. 1 set for me, 1 for you. The rest will go to students I trust." "And the people from yesterday?" Luca asked. "They'll keep looking for a box to lock," she said. "They won't notice a handful of seeds." The next day, Luca returned to the Congress Center with a new calm. He still carried the silver tray, still moved among the clusters of scholars, but now he carried something else too. The knowledge that his work was no longer entirely in one place, no longer vulnerable to a single hand. When he passed the man in the charcoal suit near the entrance, he nodded politely. The man didn't return it, but Luca kept walking. Behind him, the mist on the lake was already beginning to lift. The last day of the Congress arrived with a kind of charged stillness. The lecture halls were quieter than usual in the morning, as if everyone were already looking toward the closing ceremony that would end the week. The schedule was printed neatly on the program: a keynote address, the announcement of a few awards, closing remarks by the conference chair. Luca had planned for this day to be unremarkable. His shift was lighter, only a few trays of coffee service before the main event. He had intended to finish quietly, then return to the little rented room, pack his suitcase, and catch the evening train home. The thought of slipping back into the kitchen with his father brought a certain comfort. The Congress had been many things: surprising, tense, illuminating, but it was not his home. By midday, the main auditorium was filling. Banners from each host institution hung from the high ceiling, their colors softened by the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Rows of chairs stretched to the back wall. At the front, the great blackboard had been cleaned for the final time, its slate a deep, unbroken gray. The keynote speaker, a celebrated mathematician from India, was already at the podium when Luca stepped inside with a tray of water glasses. She spoke about the role of beauty in mathematics, about how an elegant proof could be a gift as much as an answer. Her voice carried with the ease of someone who had spent her life standing before attentive rooms. Luca placed the glasses on the side table and retreated to the back wall. He listened without meaning to, drawn by the way she spoke of ideas as if they were living things that could be tended and grown. When she finished, the applause rose and fell like a tide. The conference chair took the podium, thanked the speaker, and began the formalities. Awards were handed out, photographs taken. Then, just as the final applause began to fade, the chair adjusted his glasses and smiled toward the audience. "Before we close," he said, "we have one more guest to invite to the stage. Some of you will know the story already. Some will have only heard rumors. Either way, I think it's worth ending our week with a reminder of where curiosity can take us." He paused. "Luca, would you join us?" The sound in the room changed. A rustle, a shifting of chairs. Heads turned toward the back, where Luca stood frozen for a heartbeat. He glanced toward the side door, but Clara was there, leaning lightly against the frame. She gave the smallest nod. He set down the tray and walked forward. The aisle felt longer than it had all week. As he reached the front, the chair gestured toward the blackboard. "You've had an unusual Congress, my young friend," he said, his tone somewhere between formality and fondness. "We thought perhaps you might share a few words, not necessarily about your work, but about how you came to be here." The chalk lay on the ledge. Luca did not touch it. Instead, he turned to face the hall. He spoke simply. "I came here to serve water and coffee," he began, "to carry a tray between tables and halls. My father runs a small restaurant. My mother, before she died, helped him there. I learned early that in a kitchen, you have to find the shortest path between 2 points. Not always the straightest, but the one that works. You learn to see the map in your head." He paused, letting his eyes travel over the rows of faces. Some were smiling, some serious, all listening. "This week, I heard many of you speak about problems so large they've been unsolved for decades. I don't have the training you do, but I know the feeling of a good route when I see one. It's the same whether you're carrying bread to the table or moving from one problem to another." A small murmur of recognition ran through the hall. 2 days ago, Luca went on. I stepped to a board. Not because I thought I could solve something none of you could, but because I saw a path. I didn't know if it would reach the end, but I knew it was worth walking. He could feel the silence now, the attentive kind, not the guarded kind from the review panel, the kind that waits. In the kitchen, he said, we have a rule. If you find a better way to do something, you show the next person. Not because they will do it exactly as you did, but because they will see that it can be done. You pass the map along. He took a breath. I know that some ideas are dangerous. I've been told this one might be. Maybe that's true. But I also believe the answer to danger is not to lock the door and throw away the key. It's to teach people how to open the door without breaking what's inside. He let the words settle. So maybe P equals NP. Maybe it doesn't. I can't tell you that today. What I can tell you is that the question matters less than the habit of still asking it. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere near the middle rows, a pair of hands began to clap. The sound spread, rising until the hall was full of it. People stood. Even those who had doubted him earlier were on their feet now, not for an answer, but for the reminder that the asking itself had value. Luca stepped back from the podium. The chair shook his hand. Clara, still at the side door, gave him a look that was half pride, half warning, as if to say, you've lit the fire, now be ready for the smoke. Afterward, as the crowd spilled into the wide marble foyer, Luca felt the shift again. But this time it was not the heavy hum of doubt. It was lighter, almost like the air before a long-awaited rain. Strangers approached to shake his hand. A group of students from Poland asked if they could write to him about puzzles. An older mathematician pressed a card into his palm. You've reminded me, the man said, why I started in this field. Luca tucked the card into his pocket. He knew the week was ending. Tomorrow he would take the train home, step back into the kitchen, and carry trays of a different kind. But something had been planted here, not just in his notebook, not just in Clara's ribbon-tied packet, but in the minds of people who might one day see the same map. And when they did, perhaps they would remember that the boy who once carried water had also carried something else, the willingness to step forward when the path called to him. The train from Zurich wound its way through the hills toward the small quarter of the city where Luca's father kept the restaurant. The snow from the higher slopes had not yet reached here, but the air carried the bite of winter to come. In the carriage, Luca sat by the window, his suitcase at his feet, watching the flat fields and factory rooftops slide past. He had left the Congress quietly, without ceremony. Clara had walked him to the station, her coat collar turned up against the wind. She had handed him a slim envelope. Inside, a copy of the puzzle packet they had built together, each page neat and clean, disguised as harmless games and root problems. Keep it safe, she had said. Not hidden, safe. Seeds need light to grow, but they also need protection from frost. Her words had stayed with him as the train pulled away. The restaurant smelled of bread and roasted peppers when he stepped through the door that evening. His father looked up from the counter, surprised. You're early, Marco said, wiping his hands on his apron. The Congress isn't finished? It is for me, Luca said. He crossed the room and hugged his father, feeling the warmth in the older man's shoulders. Marco stepped back, studying his son. You look tired, and taller. Just tired, Luca said with a small smile. They ate together after closing, a simple meal of soup and crusty bread. Marco asked a few questions about the week, but Luca kept his answers brief. He spoke of the lectures, the people from all over the world, the polished floors of the Congress halls. He did not speak of the meeting in the windowless room, the unsigned paper, or the seeds wrapped in puzzles. Some things, he felt, had to wait until their time. The days fell back into their familiar pattern. Morning deliveries, the midday rush, the lull in the afternoon when Luca would clean the counters and wipe the brass handles on the front door. But something in him had shifted. In the quiet moments, he found himself sketching small diagrams in the margins of the order book. Not the mapping itself, but fragments of it, shapes and connections that looked like patterns in a tiled floor or the branches of a winter tree. One cold evening, a boy from the neighborhood came in, cheeks red from the wind. He carried a torn school notebook and a question about his mathematics homework. Marco was busy in the kitchen, so Luca sat with the boy at one of the empty tables. The problem was about finding the shortest route between towns on a map. Luca smiled. "Let's think of them as stations in a kitchen," he said. Together they found the path, and when the boy left, he was grinning. After that, other children began to stop by, sometimes for homework help, sometimes just to talk. Luca kept a small stack of scrap paper under the counter for drawing puzzles. Some were simple, others had layers, disguised in games about delivering bread or arranging tables. He never told them that a few of these puzzles carried pieces of something much larger. Winter deepened. The nights came early, the windows fogging with steam as the kitchen filled with the scent of simmering sauces. Luca worked alongside his father, their movements wordless and well-timed. Sometimes, as he wiped down the tables at closing, he would think of the Congress halls, the blackboards heavy with symbols, the applause in the grand hall. He felt no loss in being here instead. The work was different, but the habit was the same, to find the shortest road that did not spill the tray. Once, while locking up, Marco asked, "Do you ever wish you had stayed longer? Learned more?" "I'm still learning," Luca said, "just in a different place." Letters began to arrive in early spring. The first was from a student in Poland, written in careful English, thanking him for his talk at the Congress and enclosing a solution to one of the root puzzles from the packet. Another came from a university in Chile, where a group of students had found the hidden connection between two problems disguised in the packet's middle pages. Each letter was like a small green shoot breaking the surface of the soil. Clara wrote too, always in short, direct sentences. Two more have solved the fairy problem. One saw the variable gadget without naming it. Or, keep your copy dry, store it flat. Her words carried the same mix of caution and encouragement as the day they had walked by the lake. Years might pass before any of these seeds grew into something that could bear the weight of a full proof. Luca knew that. He also knew that the most important part of a seed's work happened underground, out of sight. His part, for now, was to keep tending the ground, in the kitchen, at the small table where the neighborhood children brought their questions, in the quiet hours when the bread was in the oven and the air was still. One evening in late spring, as he locked the front door, he thought about the 3 circles on the blackboard in Zurich. He wondered if someone, somewhere, was drawing them now, not because they had read his notebook or solved a disguised puzzle, but because they too had walked the kitchen of a problem and found a shorter way through. That thought made him smile. Some answers, he realized, were never meant to close the book. They were meant to open more pages, to leave the reader leaning forward, curious about what comes next. And so the mapping remained, folded into puzzles, carried in letters, whispered in the quiet between lessons. Not locked away, not shouted from rooftops. Simply alive, waiting for the season when the world would be ready to walk the bridge it built. I offer my deepest gratitude to those who have quietly crossed my path and left seeds of knowledge behind. To the teachers, friends, and chance strangers who showed me, sometimes with only a single sentence or a glance, that intellect can take root anywhere, whether in a brightly lit lecture hall or in the small corner of a kitchen where hands still carry the scent of flour. To the hands that steadied me when the road turned uneven, and to the challenges that forced me to find a shorter way through. To my father, who taught me that work is not only a means to live, but a way to reorder the world, one careful step at a time. To my mother, who, though no longer here, left me the patience of a small flame, steady enough to warm an entire room. And finally, to you, the one who took the time to listen to this story. If in these pages you have found a thought that urges you to ask one more question, then the seed has already begun to grow.